Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all the witnesses that are here today. Dr. Abu Salka, if I pronounced your name correctly, I offer you my condolences along with everyone else and sadly know your pain.
Thank you.
I wanted to know if after the tragedy, and you've been outspoken, if you have received any threats or harassment experiences of people harassing you for speaking out as a Muslim.
I personally did not. I did read an email last night that warned me of coming here and testify. But after the tragedy, there was a tweet that said 3 down, 1.6 billion to go. There was another tweet that said Craig Hicks should be given the Medal of Honor and released from custody.
Thank you. I'm very sorry to hear that. Ms. Patterson, you mentioned that you had some specific recommendations for us in terms of regarding white supremacy, and I wanted to know if you could give us a couple of examples of your recommendations.
Moment. We would like a national commission to be formed to study all forms of white supremacy. We think there should be a joint law enforcement civilian task force to study white nationalism and to outline an organized counterinsurgency strategy. We don't like the notion of the lone wolf narrative. We think there's an organized white nationalist group around the world that is being connected. We want to study the role, and I'm glad you all have brought Facebook and Google here, to study the role social media has played in enabling this threat. We need to develop a clearinghouse for data collection, reporting, and analysis on white nationalism. We need to fortify the 15th Amendment so that there's more voting on the part of disenfranchised groups. We think there should be humane immigration policy. One thing I think we need to talk about is that right now there are Latino children in cages. We think this is a definite manifestation of white supremacy and white nationalism.
Thank you very much. I think one of the first steps in addressing white supremacy, though, is really acknowledging the seriousness and the fact that it exists at all. Before our last election, we had 4 acts of domestic terrorism the week or two before, and they were not called that. From the man who had the bombs that fortunately didn't go off, the individual that was in search of African Americans to kill in Kentucky. He tried to enter a church and he couldn't, and so he killed 2 random black folks. The horrible massacre at the synagogue, and then the shooting several days later at a yoga studio where someone was looking for specifically women of color. But in that, we have the FBI that is very concerned about black identity extremists. And I just wondered, Ms. Clark, if you could tell me of examples, how many acts of domestic terrorism were carried out by African Americans in the last few years?
Well, it is our view that this black identity extremist designation is false. This was something created by the FBI's domestic terrorism analyst units to essentially target black activists today who are focused on issues like promoting police accountability. We don't see any evidence that black civil rights activists pose a threat to our democracy today.
Do you know of anyone? I know that there was a case in Texas where there was a young man who was arrested and incarcerated for a while, supposedly for being a black identity extremist. Do you know of any other cases like that?
I'm not familiar with other cases, but I will say that we have a pending Freedom of Information Act request that we sent to the FBI several months ago, and just a few days ago we received mere acknowledgement of our request. We think it's time for us to shine a light on what's happening at the FBI. It's time for us to get more information about the scope of their activities, who they're investigating, but most importantly, it's important that we find out why they're diverting resources away from the real threat that drives the purpose of this hearing today, white supremacy and white nationalism.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to also acknowledge when there was a threat by the threats that were made, President Trump was asked about whether he sees white nationalism as a rising threat around the world today. He responded that he does not, but that, quote, it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. And I believe the woman from the Anti-Defamation League, when you talked about the incidences of white supremacist terrorist acts in the United States, what was the percentage that has risen?
Over the last 10 years, it was 54%, over half. Last year, it was 78% of extremist murders were by white supremacists.
It's unfortunate that the president considers that insignificant, and it's also unfortunate that after all of these acts, whether they've taken place in the United States or around the world, that he cannot bring himself to have a full-throated denunciation of white supremacy. Thank you.